Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabarty. We are coming to you live on a Tuesday afternoon. Today is October 1st, and we have a whole lot to dive into today. We're going to talk about last night's Monday Night Football games, another week of the two games. So we'll be talking about the Lions versus the Seahawks in what was a very entertaining shootout there. And then a much less entertaining game in the Tennessee Titans versus the Miami Dolphins, but one that poses a lot of questions specifically for Miami, who were expected by a lot of people to be a playoff team coming into this year and have looked like a disaster in recent weeks since losing quarterback Tua Tagovailoa to an injury. So we are going to dive into both of those games. We're then going to be looking elsewhere across the league. We have some news as of this afternoon that Russell Wilson is nearing a return, but it seems all but imminent from what the initial reporting is that Justin Fields is going to remain the starter moving forward. We'll talk about whether or not that is the right decision. And then we are also going to be touching on their division rivals, the Cincinnati Bengals, who won their first game of the season this past weekend in what was a do-or-die game in just week 4 for the Bengals. What did we learn from this game? And is this something that the Bengals can sort of parlay into success moving forward this season, considering the fact that they have a lot of ground to make up? And then finally, we are going to be capping off the show by breaking down what was an unreal doubleheader, specifically Game 1 of the Braves versus the Mets on Monday afternoon that officially set the MLB playoff picture. And in just about half an hour, we have the situation where we are going to be talking about all of that. But before we do so, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe. We already have a comment here from Lil Fettuccini about how did the Seahawks do last night. So we're about to dive into that game in particular. But whether you have a question on, anything, let us know in the comment section. We'll try and address as much as possible. Don't forget to, again, like, follow, subscribe. Be sure to use the comment section. If you'd like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the super chat feature that is available on YouTube, or you can go to the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. With a tip or donation, you can get your comment to pop up on screen. Anything would be very greatly appreciated there. We're going to be starting off the show by diving into the Monday Night Football last night between the Detroit Lions and the Seattle Seahawks. So we already have comments here asking about this game, about how did the Seahawks do. The Seahawks, this was a game that sort of was to determine whether or not this was a fraudulent 3-0. Now, not that you can fully answer that question ever in just one game, but this was definitely a huge prove-it spot for Seattle going up against one of the best teams in the NFL in the Detroit Lions, and ultimately it ended up being a battle. Now, it took the Seahawks a little bit to sort of work into what their identity was in this game and what it should be going forward, and that is leaning on Kenneth Walker, who is an absolute animal, and he continued to prove that last night. Yesterday was his first game back from the oblique injury that he suffered in week 1, and he was incredible. 12 carries, 80 yards, and 3 touchdowns, another 36 yards through the receiving game as well. And Kenneth Walker, you just see the strength of his build and the balance that he has, just bouncing off of defenders and continuing to go. One of his touchdown runs down at the goal line was basically lit up immediately and was able to bounce off and get to the outside for a touchdown. So that is a massive positive for the Seahawks. Overall, like I mentioned, this was an offensive shootout on both sides of the ball here. I think it was probably, from an offensive perspective, a little bit more important for the Lions to have a game like this than the Seahawks, considering the fact that the Lions, more than anything, are built around that offense. I know the defense has been the side of the ball that has been carrying the Lions a little bit more through the first 3 weeks of the season. But the reality of the situation is, I think we do understand there are some shortcomings with that Lions defense. Now, a lot of it was self-inflicted. Penalties off the charts in this game. I think it was over 100 penalty yards for the Lions. So they didn't do themselves any favors allowing the Seahawks to hang around in this game. And the Seahawks were more often than not able to capitalize on that. But that being said, the defense, it has its issues. Specifically, you look at that secondary, and I thought that Carlton Davis did a pretty good job, all things considered. Him facing off against DK Metcalf, that was obviously a massive storyline surrounding the game as a whole. But I think that ultimately here, this was a game that Jared Goff really, really needed because of the fact that he really hadn't looked great through the first few weeks of the season. Him and the offense as a whole just weren't really clicking on that level that we saw last year. Goff was just signed to a $212 million contract this past offseason. So we were sort of waiting to see, just, for all intents and purposes, to back up that contract, at least to some degree. We're still early in the season, so it's not like it was anywhere near panic levels up going into last night. But it was a very nice reminder to show that Jared Goff is sort of the stability of this offense as a whole. He's not the identity. I think that was shown last night, that it was through the ground game, the two-headed monster of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs running together. They were both very impressive in this game. You look at ultimately, they were able to combine for 118 yards and 3 touchdowns together on the ground. Really impressive there. But Jared Goff, again, just sort of the leader of this offense as a whole. He had a perfect completion percentage, 18 of 18, 292 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and even caught a touchdown as well, where the Lions developed some sort of trick play where it was Amon-Ra St. Brown throwing to Jared Goff coming out of the backfield. Really impressive stuff there from the Lions offense as a whole. Like I mentioned, this was a two-way street though. Geno Smith was also very impressive in this game. 38 of 56, 395 yards, touchdown and an interception. He had career highs in completions and passing yards. That 395 yards mark is now the highest in the NFL so far this season. So a lot of positives to come out of this game on both sides. But again, I think the most important aspect of this is the Lions putting together a full game's worth of great football. And it was, again, more so on the offensive side of the ball than defense, but that is also sort of what their calling card is. And their defense has shown up to this point in the season that they have made improvements on the defensive side of the ball. But I think that ultimately the Lions aren't going to be Super Bowl contenders by winning low-scoring games game in and game out. They're going to need to put up points, and they sort of reminded the national audience once again that they are capable of it, that last year was not a fluke. And it was Goff, of course, having an incredible game himself. Like I mentioned, it was establishing the ground game. This was the Lions' first game as well without Pro Bowl center Frank Ragnow. And ultimately, they did a pretty good job of being able to make the replacement. We saw instead it was Graham Glasgow starting at center. It was Coyote Shosika. I totally just mispronounced that. I'm going to double check there. But they ended up having, a former undrafted free agent. It was Coyote Oshika. And he did, former undrafted free agent. He has started a handful of games for the Lions. He did in the NFC Championship game last year. ESPN had him third on the Detroit depth chart. And it just goes to show they continue to produce from an offensive line standpoint as well. And that is one of the most underappreciated parts of this Lions franchise, is that they just continually dominate the trenches, both in the pass game and the run game, and that's what makes them so special. And then really one of the other takeaways from last night as well is seeing the continued development of Jameson Williams in this offense, where obviously his career gets off to a bit of a sloppy start because of injuries and off the field issues, but now here he is, and he has a 70-yard touchdown in the third quarter where you can just see that blow-away speed, just leaving everybody in the dust there. That's his, I believe, third play of the season so far, with that is 50 or more yards. So again, adding that extra explosive element to this Lions offense has also been massive for them. And, it's not like Amon-Ra St. Brown isn't explosive in his own right, but I feel like he's a little bit more methodical. And Jameson Williams is just able to, and you look at that play in particular as well, it's the extra attention that Amon-Ra draws, and having somebody like Jameson Williams be able to spark those big plays. It's sort of similar to what we talked about yesterday with Justin Jefferson for the Vikings, and now you add Jordan Addison into that offense as well, and it just causes nightmares for opposing defenses. But sort of circling back here to the Seahawks as well, as Lil Fettuccini asks, can we see a rematch come playoff time? I do think that it is very possible. Now, the Seahawks are the team that I myself have had maybe a little bit of reservations about. Their, catalog of wins through that 3-0 start wasn't ultimately that impressive. Not that you play who's on your schedule, so it's not that it's their fault at all. Maybe I would have liked them to see them be a little bit more convincing against the Patriots, but you're talking about wins against Bo Nix in his first ever NFL game, the Patriots, who are very clearly not a good team, and as well you have a Tua Tagovailoa-less Miami Dolphins, which we also saw them play last night, and they are obviously offensively a disaster right now. So when I talk about, where the Seahawks are at this point and whether or not they can hang with the best teams in the NFL, I think that this is a situation where there is a lot of good you can come out of this. Like I mentioned, Kenneth Walker being the identity of that offense, I think is the direction I'd like to see them go. Now, that offensive line maybe at times has a little bit of concerns, for whatever it's worth. I would add that they seem to have one of their rookie guards, Christian Haynes, who ended up coming in for Anthony Bradford. He looked pretty good. That offensive line is an area that I don't love. So, just throwing it out there that maybe Haynes could be somebody who takes on a bigger role for the Seahawks team, as again, I think they're going to need to be able to run the ball. Geno Smith, excellent last night, having another great season, and that is massively encouraging. That being said, though, I think that there are maybe areas that you're going to, and I don't want to be disrespectful to Geno Smith, because again, he's been very impressive up to this point in the season. Maybe it's just the sort of bias in the back of my head that Geno Smith, he's still not one of those star quarterbacks. He has a ton of weapons around him. DK Metcalf with another huge game in this one. Jackson Smith and Jigba, who, for second time in 3 weeks, put together a very nice game for himself. So they have all kinds of pieces, but I really do feel like their best path to having success is operating the run game with Kenneth Walker. And then defensively, obviously, you give up 42 points. That is a very bad sign, especially, Mike McDonald, their head coach. He has a defensive background, so I'm sure he's going to be maybe pulling a little bit of hair out in film sessions, but also you take into consideration, and injury excuses, they can only go so far, but objectively speaking, the Seahawks were missing a number of key players on that defensive side of the ball. 5 of their crucial front seven players. Boye Mafe, who's been a revelation for them. Leonard Williams, one of their big investments over the past couple seasons. Rookie Byron Murphy, linebacker Jerome Baker, edge rusher Uchenna Nwosu. And add into that as well that Julian Love ended up leaving this game as well in the third quarter. So it's a situation where you definitely want their defense to perform better. I do feel like McDonald is a good enough head coach and a strategist from a defensive perspective that he can do a good job of sort of putting these guys in positions to succeed. But that was to have a depleted front seven against that Detroit Lions rushing attack and that offense, I think is an extremely tough matchup. And what the Seahawks did show is if it comes down to them having to score 3-4 touchdowns in a game, they're capable of doing so. That being said, you would like to have the defense perform a little bit better, but that's definitely an area I think that they can improve upon once they get some of these key pieces back that, if I'm not mistaken, aren't supposed to be out all too long. So the Seahawks season, yes, they suffer a loss, but they're very much still alive in this NFC race. And, you especially look at the NFC West, where I think that is a very open division as things currently stand. The Cardinals and the Rams both suffering losses this past weekend. The 49ers, they're in a situation where I would still pick them to win the division out there in the NFC West, but with all the injuries piling up, it's possible that the Seahawks, who do typically tend to play the 49ers pretty well, that they could, insert themselves into that division champ status and maybe even into a real playoff threat. I don't know if I'm quite ready to go there just yet, but I do think that there were a lot of positive signs coming out of this game that the Seahawks can continue to build on. But let me know what your thoughts were in the comment section. But this was the second straight week of having multiple Monday Night Football games going on at once. The other one did not have the same offensive firepower as this one, as the Tennessee Titans secured their first win of the season when they were able to defeat the Miami Dolphins. So we are going to dive into that. But first, I do want to address a quick comment here from Will Fettuccini from Seattle. To be honest, for 3 weeks, they were not looking good in the games that they won, that the Lions could have exposed them big time. I don't know if the Seahawks can win one game against the 49ers this year. It's a situation, I understand the doubts. I'm definitely not all aboard the Seahawks hype train right now. Like I said, I think that there are positives. That being said, you're sort of banking on a lot in terms of defensively. You can sort of chalk it up to injuries, but the reality is you got to go play football. They ended up getting run through in that game. The 49ers are another team that can also control the line of scrimmage. So you're going to have teams like that on your schedule. Niners not at full power yet. I'll double check here what the schedule looks like for when the Seahawks would be going on to face the 49ers, where they have the Niners in 2 weeks. That might be a game where they are able to, at least catch the Niners at a tougher time. But I'm also with you. I think the 49ers are the better team right now, even with the injuries considered. But just saying, the door is open for the Seahawks at this point. And I feel like year one of Mike Macdonald in Seattle, that is probably what the majority of Seahawks fans would take. So that being said, we are going to be moving on here to the other game from last night, Titans versus the Dolphins. We are going to be diving into that, but before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the face shit. I look around and feel like everybody reality is the fake as I make this. Every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up in the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, I'll diss my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the losing fit, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into the other Monday Night Football game that we got last night. That was a little bit of a slugfest, a lot of ugly football in this one, as the Tennessee Titans were able to pull off a win against the Dolphins 31-12. Now, like I mentioned, it was a couple bad offenses facing off against one another. The Titans ended up putting up 31 points, but it doesn't really feel like he was all that great. He was just 9 of 17, only 85 yards passing. In this game, the Titans were able to just sort of benefit from the fact that the Dolphins couldn't put together any sort of sustainable drives. Now, they did see, well, for starters here, like I mentioned, Mason Rudolph, don't want to blow over the fact that he did end up taking over for Will Levis after the second drive, where Levis, it was another pretty ugly start for him. First drive of the game, he ends up throwing an interception, his 9th turnover of the season. Just blatantly did not see the defender in Emmanuel Ogbah sort of sitting on that route. He was staring down DeAndre Hopkins. Ogbah was just able to sort of read him down the entire way and ended up picking him off there. And on the second drive, it was a 3-and-out for Tennessee, but Will Levis ended up diving face first for a first down on the sideline. And when he came down, he seemed to sprain something in his shoulder, it sounded like. Now, this sort of move to Mason Rudolph, and he ended up, again, not doing all that much, but was able to at least not hurt the Titans team as a whole with the turnovers, which, of course, like I mentioned, 9 already in this NFL season for Will Levis. That significantly leads the NFL up to this point, and ultimately, I think it is worth a conversation as to whether or not Mason Rudolph puts the Titans in a better position to succeed. That being said, Brian Callahan was very adamant that Will Levis is the starter moving forward as long as he is healthy. So, maybe a little bit of a decision to come in the long term, but ultimately sounds like they're still going to lean with Levis, which I can't say I totally disagree with, considering the fact that the Titans are not a team that's expecting to be in playoff contention this season anyways. So ultimately, you might as well give it more of a shot with Will Levis, because it's not like it's been all terrible with him. The turnovers have been horrendous, of course, but ultimately speaking, they have done, they've had moments at least of Levis being able to drive down the field. It's just trying to eliminate those turnover plays that have been so costly for the Titans up to this point in the season. So again, They end up putting up 31 points, the Titans do, but it was more so about you get 5 field goals from Nick Folk, who has been automatic as of late as well. You get some explosive plays from the running game and Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. That part is definitely a positive. Still no Calvin Ridley really to be seen whatsoever for this Tennessee offense, which is a bit concerning to me considering how much money they spent on him, but they also... Obviously, their biggest concern right now is trying to evaluate that quarterback position. So even if it was an overpay for Calvin Ridley, that at least, they have another weapon for him on the perimeter, but hasn't been put to use, at least as of yet. On the other side of this game, though, and I think more importantly, is the Miami Dolphins, who have been in an absolute free fall since week 2. And specifically, you can point to the moment in the third quarter where Tua Tagovailoa went down with a concussion. Now, obviously, that game wasn't great anyways, but that moment that Tua went down really changed the entire prospects of their season. Because up to this point, I mean, it's very clear they didn't have a legitimate backup plan at quarterback, which feels like a mistake in its own right. Now, Mike McDaniel seemed to think that Skylar Thompson was a reliable option for them. It hasn't really appeared that way as of yet, but as of yet, it's been one game that he ended up getting knocked out of, and very late in the Dolphins, in the game against the Bills as well in week 2. So, he's down with an injury. They're starting Tyler Huntley at this point, who is very clearly limited from a passing standpoint. He's a fine runner. He was able to sort of operate a Baltimore Ravens offense where him and Lamar have more similar skill sets relative to Huntley and Tua compared against one another. Now, if there's any sort of area of improvement, it's the fact that Tyreek Hill was sort of discussing with Tyler Huntley, a little bit animated at times, but the idea of just throwing it up and ahead of him a little bit more, as opposed, and just having those deep shots be at least a threat on the table. And Huntley did end up overthrowing Tyreek on one of those plays, but honestly, I think that is kind of something they at least need to take shots on, because they're not getting any sort of, methodical drives, realistically speaking, especially relative to the offense that they're currently running with a Tyler Huntley at quarterback, or I think with a Skylar Thompson, which does also sort of have a ripple effect of NFL fans should probably be a little bit more appreciative of what Tua is as a quarterback. We're seeing how the Dolphins are operating in his absence, and it has been a nightmare. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have reservations about Tua, the quarterback, that you are wrong in this situation, because I do still feel like Tua is limited. But that being said, some of the skills in terms of the timing, the decisiveness, having at least a good enough arm talent are things that the Dolphins are very clearly missing at this current moment without him. And that being said, the Dolphins, they seem to think that Tua is going to make a return this season. Kind of feels like the way that things are going up to this point at the current moment, that the Dolphins might not even make it later in the year to a point where the Dolphins are even going to be in contention for a playoff spot with 3 straight losses. There was a graphic that they flashed at one point at the beginning of the third quarter, ESPN did, and it was 9 points in the last 9 quarters. It stretched back to the Buffalo game. Now, ultimately, they end up, scoring 12 in this game, so they got a little bit more going for themselves, but it's still a mess there in Miami right now. And obviously for a team that is coached by Mike McDaniel, who is, and I still think is, but his identity is being an offensive mastermind. And right now it is a disaster class for that Miami offense at this current moment. That sort of leads you to the point where what are you necessarily good at this current moment? Now, they have playmakers on the defensive side of the ball. Jalen Phillips did go down with an injury in the game and ended up having to leave. Hopefully it's not too serious there, because Phillips does have some injury history and baggage there at the same time. But I think that ultimately speaking here for the Dolphins, this is a situation where they seem to think that Tua will be back and they can just sort of ride things out here. I would be pressing the panic button a little bit more in terms of you got to go out and get somebody, because at this point I just don't know what's even the point of playing the rest of this year if you're just going to be banking on Tua and you're going to be throwing him back into the fire where he has this concussion history already, and you're just going to throw him into it for the sake of what? Competing to win 6-7 games, and everything could change once Tua steps on the field. But I'm just saying that is an extreme risk that you are running in that situation. If by the time he comes back, the Dolphins are so deeply buried into this hole that they're in right now, where they're 1-3, they are, getting ultimately, kind of smoked by the Titans. The Titans completely dominated that game. It's just that Titans also just aren't that good, so they weren't fully able to make them pay. But still, a 31-12 loss is still pretty substantial, and I don't even think the Titans played all that well. I just think it was that they were better than the Dolphins in this particular moment. So for Miami at this point, they are next week on the road against the Patriots, which is a game that Patriots, not all that difficult of an opponent themselves. That being said, the Patriots are also looking at this game, myself as a Patriots fan, saying this is, probably one of the few games in the upcoming stretch where the Patriots can actually win, considering the fact that their offense looks even worse than the Patriots' offense, which is very hard to do at this current moment given what's going on in New England. But that being said, maybe a big spot for the Dolphins to at least pull out a win here and then go into the bye week in week 6 and be able to sort of settle down and find some sort of an identity. I just don't know if they have the answer at quarterback currently in that locker room between Tyler Huntley and Skylar Thompson, or Tim Boyle as well is in the mix there. So I think that, there are probably upgrades out there. It's probably going to be one of your cheaper options at that. Maybe a Jimmy Garoppolo. Maybe you get a Russell Wilson, which is a situation that has some developments as of this afternoon that we're about to dive into. I'm not saying that there are elite options out there. Maybe if you want to go and spend a little bit more, you go for a Jameis Winston or a Bryce Young, but I don't really see those types of deals panning out for the Dolphins at this point. So they're just kind of stuck middling right now. And again, maybe Tua is just going to be able to sort of resurrect this team and have it be able to come back together. But at this point, I think what I was at least initially hearing when it first occurred, the injury, that it was going to be a minimum of 8 weeks. That would take them through week 10. At that point, the way that they're playing right now, I don't have very much confidence whatsoever that they will be even in the mix for the playoffs. That I think it might be worth going out and spending a little bit to go at least get a temporary solution. And then if you have some setbacks with Tua, at least you have an option for the remainder of the season. But either way, things are looking very grim in Miami right now. And this is coming off of a year where they spent big on Tua, spent big on Mike McDaniel in the offseason. And to see it play out like this has been very disappointing. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. I did just mention the idea of the Dolphins potentially being able to make a trade for somebody like a Russell Wilson, and that sort of goes hand in hand with the fact that we got some news as of this afternoon that Russell Wilson is trending towards returning from that calf injury that he's been dealing with, but it appears that Justin Fields will remain the starter. And we are going to dive into a little bit of their game this past weekend against the Indianapolis Colts, in which they suffered their first loss, and talk about what that quarterback situation currently looks like there in Pittsburgh. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as I now want to dive into a little bit of news that broke this afternoon in the NFL, and that is from, of course, ESPN's Ian Rappaport, that tweeted out about how Russell Wilson, quote, "if all goes well, likely ends this week as a full participant, and Justin Fields continues to start." So, very interesting situation there in Pittsburgh, where going back to this offseason, I mean, we've rehashed this topic a number of times throughout, the offseason and headed into this season, that you're talking about two quarterbacks in Pittsburgh that are getting fresh starts there, so the organization really has no extensive ties to either one of them, and they brought in both options because they knew they needed to reshuffle their quarterback room after what was a messy situation last year with Kenny Pickett, Mitchell Trubisky, and Mason Rudolph. So they now bring in Wilson and Fields, and Wilson ended up winning the starting job at the, coming out of training camp. Really, more than anything, and I've talked about it before, I feel like it was more so as a result of the fact that Wilson was brought in first and he was maybe guaranteed a starting spot a little bit more than Fields, who a few weeks later the Steelers decided to trade for at a pretty low price. And I think that Mike Tomlin and the Steelers organization, all things considered, is one of the more well-run franchises in the NFL, and maybe more respectable in terms of Tomlin feels like he is more of a player's coach and he's a man of his word, and all things considered there. I feel like it was, I always said that I thought that Justin Fields would be the better man for the job in this Steelers offense, where they aren't exactly extremely talented on the front line. I've talked about a number of times that the offensive line is an issue to me, that we are looking at a situation where you have one, I would say, good receiver, and, George Pickens is very talented. Sometimes he does stuff on the field, like the fumble that he had, reaching out for a first down that was just a little bit boneheaded, and that was on second down as well, so it's not like it was a do or die situation. He fumbles there in the red zone, then just a couple drives later he does sort of try to do the same thing. That there are frustrating parts to George Pickens' game, but all things considered, he's still massively talented. He finished this game with 7 receptions for 113 yards, so he's really good. Outside of that, though, really don't have much from a receiving standpoint. Get some production from your tight ends. Pat Freiermuth ended up having a pretty decent game for himself this past Sunday. Freiermuth has always been somebody that I've been a fan of, but from a wide receiver standpoint, it's largely lackluster. And Justin Fields is somebody who can at least create more with his legs. Russell Wilson, obviously, he's made a career off of using his legs, extending plays, and then making throws downfield. So it's not that he's incapable of doing it, but I think at this point, with Wilson's age, he is at a point where he's not going to be running a heavy dose of quarterback-designed runs. He's 35 years old, turning 36 in November, as opposed to Justin Fields, who is, at a point where his career is still so unproven as of now, at least in the eyes of a lot of people. He is a first-round bust. Now, a lot of people are also blaming Chicago for that, which I do agree with in large part. I think that Justin Fields is a flawed quarterback, but I do ultimately think that there's a lot of talent there and that he has a chance to be able to resurrect himself in Pittsburgh. And now that he seems to have a little bit more of a competent coaching staff around him, which is kind of crazy to phrase it like that when you're talking about, Arthur Smith is also his offensive coordinator, who I've always stood by. Arthur Smith isn't a bad offensive coordinator. I thought he did a very good job when he was in Tennessee. Now, obviously, in over his head when he was in Atlanta. So that's sort of besides the point there. But he has him, he has Tomlin, and it feels like there's just a lot more of a structure. And the Steelers, especially in comparison to the Bears, are just a franchise that appears to know a lot more about, actually developing players and tailoring a game to their skill sets and putting the necessary pieces in place. Again, it's not like right now the Steelers are some elite offense where Justin Fields has weapons galore, which is kind of more so the case in Chicago right now, and their offense is still dysfunctional. But the Steelers have been able to sort of weed out a lot of the mistakes from Justin Fields and are sort of gradually here taking the training wheels off and letting him do more. He finishes with 312 yards and a touchdown in the game this past weekend. Now, did have a very costly fumble in this game in the third quarter that ended up, sort of going against them. But I think all things considered, you are seeing the growth from Justin Fields in this situation. And as much as Mike Tomlin, I'm sure, feels like to some degree he would prefer to sort of stand by whatever, word he gave to Russell Wilson when Wilson first signed with them. And I do think that, Tomlin is going to find a way to make things right, at least to some degree. I'm sure internally, and especially in that front office, they would very much prefer that Justin Fields does emerge for this job and can be somebody for them that is a franchise caliber quarterback, even if it is, just signing maybe a little bit of a Baker Mayfield type contract. Now, $100 million for what Fields has given you on the field right now feels very extreme, and I don't think it would be to that extent, but I think that Fields could probably, be in the market of whatever Sam Darnold is going to get. Darnold has been the better quarterback as of up to this point in the season. But again, I think we're seeing real, growth from Fields. I feel like he is probably going to be a little bit more okay with now being in this situation in Pittsburgh. Now that, assuming he starts the rest of the season, which is sort of where I'm anticipating this to happen, or the direction that this is going to go. I feel like Fields will probably be okay with maybe even taking a little bit less than what a Sam Darnold gets, just to have maybe a 2-3 year deal here with Pittsburgh where he can continue to develop, because Fields is still very young. He's 25 years old, so he can even afford to just guarantee himself another few years in the league and still develop on who he is. Now, we'll see what the overall level of production that Fields can, produce at this point moving forward in this year. But I think that Fields makes them a very competitive team moving forward. And it's just about eliminating those mistakes. Like I mentioned, has a turnover in each of the past 2 weeks. That's what you really don't want to see, especially because that fumble from him in this game against the Colts did come at a pretty costly time for them, where I want to double check here, but it was in the third quarter as the Steelers were trying to, mount a little bit more of a comeback, and they were competitive at the end of this game. I mean, they had the ball with a few minutes left in the game in a 3-point game. But ultimately, Fields just wasn't able to sort of pull this one out, and that's all right. We're still looking at, baby steps here, and he's somebody who's been in the league now for 4 years. That it's not a great sign necessarily. The bar has definitely been reset to a much lower level. But again, I feel like at somebody just 25 years old, there is still a significant amount of time to be able to, take steps towards being the right direction. You look at Sam Darnold, where I can double check here, but this is now his 7th year in the NFL. It's his 7th year in the NFL at this point. He's still 27 years old. So, if he can make it work, given everything that he's been through, I still feel like there is a very real path to sort of making Justin Fields into a positive starting quarterback once again. Now, it's going to, maybe take a little bit of patience from the Steelers, and I think that they're okay with that also because, no, the defense didn't necessarily show up in this game in particular, but the defense is good enough as well that that's what Steelers fans and the Steelers organization themselves can sort of hang their hat on and, again, just have a quarterback that provides a certain skill set that they can capitalize on and have an identity on that offensive side of the ball, which they've really been lacking these past few seasons. I've mentioned, dating back to the older version of Ben Roethlisberger that we got, that they haven't really had a great quarterback. They just haven't gotten great quarterback play in a handful of years. And the Steelers are hoping to be able to make the playoffs and actually capitalize on the situation, win their first playoff game since 2016. Is Fields the man for that job yet? As of week 4, I would say no. But as he continues to get more and more comfortable in this situation, I think that he can. And on the other end of this as well, Russell Wilson, I feel like it's very likely that we do see, like I mentioned, Mike Tomlin try and make things right with him, send him to a situation where he can start. Specifically, looking at a Miami, probably, maybe. Miami really does make sense as the one team, I think, that could really benefit from him now. There are other teams that need quarterbacks. Like, I think that the Titans do. I think that the Raiders do. I'm not sure if Russell Wilson is a starter week 1 there or if their aspirations are necessarily to win playoff games like that. So I'm not sure. I think it's more of just a statement on where Russell Wilson is at this point in his career. And this might be it, which would be unfortunate because Russell Wilson is one of the more fun players in NFL, in recent NFL history. 2010s at that quarterback position, had a lot of great moments, but it just might be time for him. But we are going to, switch gears here to another team in that same division in the AFC North, where the Cincinnati Bengals were able to win their first game of the season against the Carolina Panthers. So we are going to be diving into that game, what it means for the Bengals moving forward. But first, we're going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into the story surrounding the Cincinnati Bengals, where they were able to pick up their first win of the 2024 season, week 4 against the Panthers. This was just about as must-win as it can get so early on in the NFL season, and the Bengals capitalized on having an inferior opponent in the Carolina Panthers. Now, this was the Andy Dalton revenge game. Panthers were coming off of an offensive explosion the week prior against the Raiders. That being said, though, I think it says, a good amount about the Raiders. That's what our expectations were headed into this season. The Bengals -4.5 was one of our best bets from Friday. So I'm not surprised by this whatsoever. That being said, though, there was definitely a ton of pressure on that organization to be able to pull out this game, because if you end up losing to the Panthers, it's basically wraps on the season, and a playoff shot is entirely out of the picture, all things considered, especially in that AFC North that is so difficult. So they at least sort of stay afloat in all of this. They maybe benefit slightly from the fact that the Steelers and the Bengals both lose. Those are two of the teams that I still feel like the Bengals are the second best team in that division behind the Ravens, but they have a little bit of ground to make up in order to actually, prove that to the world. And I think that, the number one thing with the Bengals over the past couple of weeks, and of course this includes last week when they lost to the Commanders, is this offense finally, looks functional once again. I say finally as if really I only think that week 1 was the bad offensive performance from them. I still think that even in that game and even in the loss to the Chiefs, that Joe Burrow has been good, been solid. Now, obviously, when you're talking about Burrow and what his reputation is, I think that he is pretty clearly a top 4 quarterback in the NFL. And I think that, being good doesn't necessarily cut it, especially, we've seen plenty of quarterbacks this year look good so far. Sam Darnold, Geno Smith, to name a couple there that weren't necessarily, fully expected to be like all that great coming into the year. Joe Burrow, he didn't elevate his team in the first few weeks, and that's what a lot of the criticism was. I didn't get behind that he didn't play well enough in that Washington game whatsoever. That was definitely a big sort of ESPN, hot take segment there. I don't know what Joe Burrow, there were some drives that they ended up having to settle for field goals in the first half. Really, it was just that first field goal. And at that point, I think that you take the points there. It was far more on the defense, the fact that they weren't able to produce any stops. The Bengals themselves on offense didn't get stopped either, and they come into this game against the Panthers and sort of have everything to lose if they end up falling short. And all things considered, I think it was a pretty convincing win for them, 34-24. Now, the defense still yet to really prove themselves, and that is a huge concern of mine. But if I want to stick with the offense here for a quick minute, I think that this is a situation. They've turned the corner. They had their growing pains coming out of the gates. Jamar Chase, is sort of back on track. He had over 100 yards. I think it was 115 and 2 touchdowns against Washington on Monday. In this game, 85 yards and a touchdown. The majority of them coming on that 163-yard touchdown, but you'll take the production however it comes. T. Higgins, a lot more involved in the offense, led the team in targets with 10, ended up with 6 catches for 60 yards. So that is also a positive sign in my books. And then saw some, legitimately good running from that combination in the backfield, Chase Brown and Zach Moss. Really, it was Chase Brown who emerged. Fantasy football users will probably point to the fact that Chase Brown was sort of having some higher expectations in his sophomore season, got out to an incredibly slow start where he only had 3 carries in game 1, 4 carries in game 2, but we're starting to see him get some more looks. And ultimately, you look at this situation where now it's 62 yards against Washington, 80 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game. That is also a very positive development from them as well, because of the fact that, after losing Joe Mixon, there were a lot of questions. And they bring in Zach Moss, who's a fine running back, but hoping for a little bit more explosiveness. And Chase Brown, he was at least, I think, an upgrade in terms of change of pace from what we've seen up to this point, and I think there's a lot of positives there. So, that being said, the defensive side of the ball, like I mentioned, is definitely still a concern. You look at that secondary where they've just still continued to get thrown on. Now, it's not like Andy Dalton went crazy against them. It was 220 yards, but ultimately, secondary you bring in these pieces during the offseason and Von Bell and Geno Stone, and it hasn't exactly paid dividends yet. You look at the struggles that the Bengals have had against the run up to this point. Another 100-yard rusher against them in Chuba Hubbard for this game, and that has definitely been a clear issue. Lou Anarumo talked about it after the Chiefs game. At that point, in his eyes, it was just trying to make sure the ball was getting out of the hands of Patrick Mahomes. But then you look at these past couple games as well, where you let the Commanders they did a better job actually against the Commanders, so I should correct myself there. But you look at the situation now against the Panthers where, Andy Dalton, he's a good quarterback. The Bengals, I'm sure, internally definitely respect him, considering they are aware of the years that he's had in his career. But that being said, Chuba Hubbard coming off of the big game that he had, I feel like if you shut down that defensive, you shut down the front end of that offense in the trenches with that running game, and you force Andy Dalton to go into superhero mode a little bit more, that's where you can sort of, escape with wins like that. And so it was a good win. It was a win for the Bengals, definitely. I still don't think it teaches us anything new about who this Bengals team is. I think it provides some reassurance for the offense now, once again, being prominent. That being said, though, the real test is going to be this upcoming week against the Ravens, where if they can pull that one out, I think they are pretty comfortably back on track in all of this. But based off of the way that they've been ran against through, I'd say really 3 out of the 4 games, because I'd throw the Patriots week 1 in there as well, that I feel like this is going to be a situation where the Ravens are going to have a lot of opportunities to run on this Bengals defense. Can they shut that down? Can they make the adjustments there? Because I talk about the secondary. I do feel like there are players in that group that I do like. It's just they haven't really shown it up to this point yet. They're capable of doing that. I feel like you commit to stopping the run of the Ravens. They don't exactly have a ton of high-flying pass catchers. Zay Flowers is a good player. Have a tight end combination in Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews that even if Andrews is having a bad season up to this point, this is a situation where, they are still a very talented group there anyways, the duo there. So I feel like, this is kind of make or break time for the Bengals, where they have this uphill battle. They're going to have to find a way to win games against tougher opponents, because at this point, they don't have enough cupcake games on their schedule to just sort of waltz their way into 9 wins. They let that slip, and not that, the Commanders seem like they might be a legitimate team in the NFL now, but that's a game, 6.5-point favorites you have to win. Beating the Patriots, it might have been 7.5 even, now that I think about it. That and the Patriots game, but they need to sort of now punch above their weight class. And I thought they did that for the most part in that Chiefs game until they let it slip away from them in the fourth quarter. And now is sort of the time to prove themselves. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section, as we're now going to be switching gears here to the MLB, where the wild card series are taking place now. We have a game going on right now that's off to a hot start for one potential Cinderella team. So we're going to be talking about what was a crazy day in the MLB yesterday with the doubleheader between the Braves and the Mets. And then we're going to be running through all of the matchups and I'm going to be making my picks for this round of games. So stick with us and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where the MLB playoffs begin today. We actually have one game that just kicked off 30 minutes ago. That is between the Astros and the Tigers. Tigers off to a hot start through the first 2 innings, up 3-0. So I do want to talk about that series, but first, before we get into the overall scale here of the playoff games, I at least want to share some thoughts here on what was an unreal day in the MLB yesterday. I'm sure you've probably already heard the story by this point, but yesterday we saw the insanity of that doubleheader between the Braves and the Mets with playoff stakes on the line. Both the Braves and the Mets needed at least one win to make the playoffs. Both were half a game behind the Arizona Diamondbacks, who were sitting at 89 wins. And, if either one of those teams swept, the Diamondbacks would be in, along with the team that swept. If they split, though, it was going to be the two of them, and that did end up being the case. But that game one of that doubleheader sort of being a standalone game at that point and having the drama that we saw was unbelievable. The back and forth down the stretch of that game with the 3 lead changes and 3 half innings was just so much fun to watch. Again, I'm going to try and make this brief here because you probably already heard about this, but Braves rookie Spencer Schwellenbach ended up cruising through the first 7 innings of this game into the 8th with a 3-0 lead for the Braves. And then he allows a leadoff double to Tyrone Taylor. The Braves decide to pull him, and the bullpen allows 6 consecutive hits and 6 runs before even recording an out. So the Mets head into the bottom of the 8th with a 6-3 lead. They end up allowing a little bit of traffic, bringing in their $100 million closer in Edwin Diaz, who records the first out and then proceeds to just completely fall apart, where he ended up walking he allowed an infield single to Jared Kelenic because he didn't back up first base. He ends up walking Michael Harris on 4 pitches. Then he gets himself backed up in the count once again, and Ozzie Albies hits a 2-run RBI double as the Braves ended up regaining the lead going into the 9th inning. So, it seemed like disaster there for the Mets once again. In the top of the 9th inning, it's Francisco Lindor hitting a 2-run home run that ended up being the game-winning runs for the Mets. But the drama didn't end there because it was Edwin Diaz calling off his manager in Mendoza in the bottom of the 9th inning to stay on the mound even after allowing a single, and he ends up closing the door there. So Mets win that game. They clinch their playoff berth. Game 2, really the drama came before the game because it trickles into the playoffs here, where the Braves win, I'd say mostly handedly. Mets just didn't really seem to, have that emphasis really behind winning this game. But issues for the Braves as Chris Sale ended up missing this game. He was scratched just before. It sounded like he was going to pitch in case of a loss, but instead he's scratched because of back spasms that go back to his last start in the 2nd inning. And the Braves close this one out, but still a little bit of concern because it doesn't sound like Sale is going to be available for them in the wild card round. At least this is going to be, of course, the NL Cy Young winner, and you're without him. Braves just riddled with injuries, of course. We don't have an exact starter for this game 1. It's probably going to be Max Fried, but we don't quite know. The Braves, like I mentioned, get out of this game with a win, but definitely a tough situation to walk into moving forward. You got to feel for the Diamondbacks a little bit. Very good team that are playoff caliber. Fortunately for them, the wild card race in the National League was just too much in the National League this year. So it is the Mets advancing to play the Brewers and the Braves advancing to play the Padres, excuse me. So we will start in that National League for here. The New York Mets Game 1 it's expected to be Luis Severino versus Freddie Peralta. Mets benefiting from the fact that they won Game 1 and didn't have to start Severino in Game 2 for what would have been a must-win. Likely would have been the case that if they did lose that first game, they would have been down their ace. So they end up getting to benefit from having him on their Game 1 scorecard. The Brewers have gotten the better of the Mets in the past couple seasons, which is something to maybe take into consideration. I don't really love weighing the regular season records versus the playoff records. I just think it's a totally different game once you get to that point. But the one concern here for the Mets I have outside of that is the fact that Francisco Lindor is still sort of running on fumes a little bit with that back injury that he's dealing with. Although yesterday with that go-ahead home run in the ninth showed it might not be an issue. The Mets kind of give me Team of Destiny vibes, and I don't know if they're going to be able to hold up deep into the playoffs, but I do think that this is a very winnable series for them versus a pitching staff in the Brewers that has done a lot of the heavy lifting for the season as a whole, but not one that I necessarily trust at this point. Got Savali pitching Game 2. I don't know. I think that the Mets are going to be able to pull this one out. That is my pick for the wild card series there. And then the Braves playing the Padres. Like I mentioned, very nervous about the pitching situation for the Braves, knowing that Chris Sale is not expected to be available. That is what manager Brian Snitker ended up saying to reporters. I believe it was yesterday or early this morning that's a huge loss for them. And then on the other end, I'm just so in on this Padres team. 3 projected starters for this series: Michael King, Joe Musgrave, and if necessary, Dylan Cease. That is a much better group than the other side there in Atlanta, especially given the fact that Atlanta had to go deep into their bullpen in Game 2 of that. The fact that they put out Reynaldo Lopez for that game, their all-star relief pitcher in that game, is a pretty significant sign of they were a little bit desperate. They might be running on fumes a little bit. I just think that the Padres are going to be able to sort of jump on them early, and They have the best bullpen in the MLB as well, at least out of the remaining teams, in my opinion, at this point. So I think that they're going to be able to close this one out. Their offense is still loaded, excellent at putting the ball in play. I think they're going to drive up the pitch counts of Atlanta, and this is a situation where I think it was already a tough enough task for the Braves in a regular situation, coming off of that doubleheader as well. I am going to go with the Padres. In the American League, Royals versus Orioles. Both of these teams aren't exactly coming into the playoffs on any sort of a hot note. The Orioles at least finished with 2 straight series wins versus the Yankees and the Twins, including sweeping the Twins for 3 games to end off the season. That being said, this is a team that was riding so high into the All-Star break and has just sort of continued to fall apart a little bit since then. And not to say that they aren't still a very talented roster, which they are, but I don't know if this is really the right trajectory for them. Now, on the bright side for them, they just get Jordan Westburg back. The offense appears to be playing at a higher level at this point, so that could be enough. They're going to need to produce offensively in order to keep up with Kansas City, who sort of clears the Orioles in terms of pitching strength, both with the starting rotation and in the bullpen. That I think, that's really going to be the key to this series as a whole. You also have the Royals getting a crucial piece back in Vinny Pasquantino, who was expected to be out a handful more weeks. He broke his thumb at the end of August, but Jeff Passan just reported earlier this morning that he is expected to play today, likely hit in that 3rd spot for them. So we'll see if he's fully okay. That's massive because the Royals are fairly reliant on sort of the top of their lineup to do the heavy lifting. But I think in a 3-game series, you have a clear pitching advantage here, specifically in comparison to the Orioles, who are without 2 of their top 3 starters. No Kyle Bradish, no Grayson Rodriguez. My gut tells me it's going to be a come down to pitching in the end of this, and I just trust Kansas City a lot more than I do Baltimore. So I am going to pick the Royals in this one. And then Tigers versus Astros. Kind of a tough position for me right now, making my prediction as the game is going on, considering the fact that the Tigers are currently up right now 3-0. This is, what I had in my notes even before this game started was that this is the game that is a must-win for the Tigers, and there's three games in a series, so it's not like that's any sort of crazy statement, but this is a situation where you have the best pitcher in baseball in Tarik Skubal versus a good Framber Valdez, but somebody who allows a lot of contact, and that's been the case, through 3 innings right now in this game, that they need to capitalize on this Skubal start for them right now. And up to this point, that has been the case. But even that being said, I'm going with the Astros in this. I understand the odds would be a little bit more in my favor at this current moment if I did hop on board with the Tigers while they're up, but I just think that the Astros are still so talented. They've played like the best team in baseball down the second half of the season, probably outside of the Padres is where I would officially, sort of give that title. But I think the Astros have still been playing incredible baseball. They have all of this experience. You're talking about a Tigers team that is making their first playoff appearance in 10 years based off of how last year's playoffs went, and you get a couple teams sub 90 wins in the World Series against one another in the Rangers and in the Diamondbacks, that, the Tigers would be a surprising run, but again, based off of last year, that sort of Cinderella run, I think is very much in the cards. That being said, I'm sticking with the Astros because I do think that they are the best team in the American League. Ultimately, again, I would take the Padres over them. I probably, if I were to, I guess we can call this my official prediction, is Astros versus Padres in the World Series and having the Padres come out on top. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. We're going to be back, obviously, tomorrow with a more comprehensive breakdown on what we're seeing from the first set of action today. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe, wherever you may be keeping up with us. And be sure to check us out on social media as well. So, as for that, we will see you guys tomorrow. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.